The morning of promise. The morning air carried a crisp freshness as it drifted through the half-open window, mingling with the aroma of fresh coffee brewing in the kitchen. Evan Mitchell leaned against the counter, watching his son, Marcus, bustle about with a burst of energy that was contagious. His movements were quick, darting back and forth as he prepared for the day ahead. His backpack was nearly bursting with every imaginable thing he thought he might need for their trip: snacks, his favorite superhero action figure, a magnifying glass he'd somehow decided was a necessary item for zoo exploration, and even a small notebook to draw what he might see. Evan chuckled at his son's enthusiasm. He knew Marcus's imagination knew no limits, and this trip to the zoo was the pinnacle of the child's wild dreams. As a parent, there was nothing more fulfilling than seeing that boundless excitement, especially knowing how much it meant to both him and Ava. This wasn't just another family outing. It was a long-awaited moment for them, a journey that symbolized so much more than the simple act of visiting a zoo. Evan's eyes traced Marcus's movements around the room. He couldn't help but reflect on how far he had come in his own life, how much he had struggled to get to a place where he could give his son the experiences he had once dreamed of but never had. Growing up, his family had never been able to afford trips to places like zoos, aquariums, or theme parks. There were months when the simple act of putting food on the table was a challenge. But now, as a father, Evan was determined to make sure his son knew what it was like to experience the world in all its vibrant, awe-inspiring colors. He wanted Marcus to know that there was more to life than the struggles and limitations he might face, more than the looks from strangers, or the judgment that sometimes followed them. Ava stepped into the room, her smile lighting up her face as she saw her son's excitement. She had always been the calm in their little family's whirlwind, balancing out Evan's fiery passion with her steady and quiet strength. She was the anchor that kept them grounded, the one who could always read between the lines and know when a storm was brewing in her husband's heart. "I think Marcus is ready to go," Ava said, her voice light but filled with affection. She ruffled Marcus's hair as she passed him, and he grinned up at her with an infectious joy. "Are you sure you don't want to pack anything else?" Evan asked, teasing, though it was obvious that Marcus had thought of everything. "I'm all set, Dad." Marcus replied proudly, adjusting the straps of his backpack and looking up at Evan with wide, sparkling eyes. "I've got everything. Water, snacks, my lion figurine, and, oh, my magnifying glass. Gotta see the ants, too." He laughed at his own excitement, his voice filled with pure, unadulterated joy. Evan reached over, pulling his son into a quick hug. "You're going to have a great time today, buddy. And remember, we're making memories, not just looking at animals. It's about us, together." Ava smiled warmly, but there was a brief moment of silence between them, a shared understanding that seemed to hang in the air. They both knew what it meant to be a family, what it meant to be a black family, raising their child in a world that often saw them through different eyes. They had faced stares, unspoken judgments, and sometimes outright ignorance. But that wasn't going to stop them from creating the kind of life they had always dreamed of. And certainly, not today. The trip to the zoo wasn't just about seeing lions and tigers, it was about showing Marcus what the world could be like, a place of beauty, wonder, and possibility. A place where he could feel free, where he could explore and dream without the weight of being other. Ava took a deep breath and gave Evan a look that said it all, a reminder to be strong and focused. They had both been there before, standing tall in the face of unspoken challenges, finding joy in the moments that mattered most. Marcus, oblivious to the complexities of the world his parents navigated, continued to talk excitedly about the animals he was going to see. And the elephants. "Oh, I'm going to ask them how they got so big. I bet they eat tons of food every day, huh, Mom?" he said, his imagination racing. Ava laughed softly. "I'm sure they do, sweetie. But I think they'll be more focused on you than you on them." Marcus giggled, imagining himself talking to an elephant, standing face to face with such a giant creature. He didn't understand the complexities of the world just yet, but in his mind, everything was simple, full of wonder, and full of hope. His parents would guide him through the uncertainties of life, helping him navigate the difficult moments, but for now, he was just a child on the cusp of discovering all the marvels the world had to offer. The day ahead promised to be a memorable one. The zoo was only a short drive away, but it felt as though the journey itself was part of the experience. They had talked about this day for so long, and now it was finally here. Marcus's laughter and chatter filled the car as they drove through the city, weaving through the streets and toward their destination. As they neared the zoo, Evan glanced in the rearview mirror, catching Ava's eye. They shared a brief, silent conversation through that look, a mutual understanding of how much today meant, how much it represented. Despite the challenges they might face in the world, they were determined to create a life full of love, adventure, and joy. They were determined to give their son a chance to see the beauty of life, even in the face of adversity. "We're here," Evan said as he turned the car into the zoo's parking lot, the familiar sign coming into view. Marcus's eyes grew even wider as he spotted the giant elephant statue near the entrance. "Look, Dad." "Elephants," he squealed, his excitement palpable. "We're really here," Ava said softly, her hand resting gently on Evan's arm. It was a quiet moment of gratitude, a recognition of how far they had come, of how much they had overcome to create this experience for their son. They parked the car and, one by one, they exited the vehicle, ready to embark on the adventure of a lifetime. The zoo was waiting for them, but it wasn't just about animals, it was about their family, their bond, and the stories they would create together. And though they didn't know it yet, this day would become far more extraordinary than they could have ever imagined. It would shape their understanding of the world in a way that would change them forever. The zoo experience begins. The zoo stretched out before them, a sprawling oasis of greenery and wildlife nestled just outside the city. As they passed through the gates, the sounds of excited chatter and the calls of animals filled the air, mingling with the laughter of children and the occasional roar of a distant lion. It was a sensory overload, a symphony of life in all its forms. Marcus's eyes darted around, wide with wonder, as his feet carried him forward, eager to explore every corner of this new, exciting world. "I can't believe I'm finally here," Marcus exclaimed, his voice bubbling with enthusiasm. "I'm going to see everything, and I'm going to take the best notes for my book." He held up his small notebook, the cover adorned with colorful stickers of animals, ready to document every moment. Ava smiled fondly, her heart swelling with pride at her son's excitement. She had always known that Marcus had a special connection with the world around him. His ability to see the magic in the simplest things was something to be cherished. She had made it a point to encourage his curiosity, nurturing it so that one day, he could walk through the world with a sense of wonder and respect. Today, that sense of wonder was palpable, and she knew it would shape Marcus's view of the world in ways they couldn't yet comprehend. Evan walked alongside them, his gaze flickering between Marcus and the zoo around them. He was just as excited as his son, though in a quieter way. This was his chance to give Marcus what he had never had, a world to explore, to experience with the excitement of a child, to see through his son's innocent eyes. It was a privilege, one that Evan didn't take lightly. He had worked hard to provide for his family, to make sure they could have moments like this one. The zoo had a special kind of magic. There was something about being surrounded by the vastness of nature that made everything feel bigger than life itself. The exotic smells of tropical plants and animals, the occasional flash of bright colors from a parrot or a flamingo, the sight of towering giraffes moving gracefully across their enclosures, it was all mesmerizing. Marcus was particularly entranced by the elephants. As they walked past the large elephant enclosure, he was completely captivated by the gentle giants, their massive frames moving slowly through the exhibit, their trunks swaying as they reached for the branches of trees. Marcus pressed his hands against the fence, staring in awe at the creatures who seemed so calm and wise. "Do you think the elephants remember everything they see?" Marcus asked, his eyes fixed on one of the elephants as it flapped its large ears, cooling itself in the warmth of the sun. Ava knelt beside him, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. I think they remember a lot. Elephants are very smart, and they have incredible memories. They can even remember the faces of other elephants from years ago. Wow, Marcus breathed, looking up at his mother with wide, respectful eyes. Maybe they remember us, too. Evan chuckled, enjoying the innocence of his son's thoughts. Maybe, buddy. Maybe they do. But whether they remember or not, they sure are magnificent creatures. Their path continued through the zoo, each new exhibit sparking a fresh wave of excitement from Marcus. He eagerly pointed out every animal he had read about in his books, sharing interesting facts he'd memorized. There was a sense of joy that radiated from him, a joy that was contagious, and even Ava, who had once worried about the hidden challenges of being a black family in a space like this, found herself relaxed and at ease. Today, she realized, was about something more than just the animals. It was about creating moments where her family could simply exist, free from the tension that often came with being different. They were here, together, and that was all that mattered. As they made their way toward the lion's den, the pinnacle of Marcus's anticipation, Evan noticed a subtle shift in the atmosphere. It wasn't something overt, just an undercurrent of tension that he couldn't quite place. People were still smiling, still pointing out the animals, but there was something in the air that felt off. Evan couldn't help but notice the occasional glance in their direction. People staring a little too long, whispering behind their hands, and though Marcus was blissfully unaware, Evan couldn't shake the feeling that they were somehow out of place. It was a feeling he had known all too well growing up, being scrutinized, judged without reason, simply because of who he was. His heart tightened in his chest for a moment, but he pushed the feeling aside. Today wasn't about that. Today, they would create memories of joy and togetherness. The rest didn't matter. Mom, look! The lions! Marcus's voice broke through Evan's thoughts as he pointed excitedly to the massive lion exhibit ahead. The lion's den was situated at the far end of the zoo, with high walls and thick glass separating the visitors from the magnificent creatures inside. It was one of the most popular exhibits, and as they approached, the area seemed to buzz with anticipation. The lions lay lounging in the sun, their golden manes glowing against the backdrop of the savanna-like enclosure. Marcus's eyes were glued to the lions, and he practically pulled his parents toward the glass. Dad, can you see that one? Marcus said, his finger pressed against the glass. He's so big, like a superhero. Look at the size of his paws. Evan smiled at his son's excitement, leaning in to get a better look. That's a big one, all right. I bet his paws could probably hold a football field if he wanted to, he joked. They all chuckled at the thought. For Marcus, the lions represented something grand, something untouchable in his youthful imagination. He had been fascinated by them ever since he was old enough to understand what they were. His favorite animal had always been the lion, its power and majesty captivating his young mind. Can we go closer? Marcus asked eagerly, pressing his face against the glass, hoping to get a better view. Ava looked around, noting that the area was getting crowded, and there were a few other children near the enclosure. Let's hang back for a moment and let everyone else have a turn. We'll get another chance to get closer. Marcus nodded, but it was clear he could hardly wait. He was ready to be in the presence of these magnificent creatures, to feel the full force of their power and grace, even if only from behind the glass. As they stood there, taking in the scene, Evan couldn't help but reflect on how far they had come. Not just in terms of their journey to the zoo, but in the journey of their family as a whole. They had fought through obstacles, defied expectations, and worked harder than most could imagine to provide their son with a life full of opportunity. And here they were, experiencing something beautiful, something that would stay with them forever. For the first time in a long time, Evan let himself relax. He was grateful for the moment, for the joy that filled their family, and for the realization that no matter what challenges they might face, they could overcome them together. "Are you having fun?" Ava asked Marcus, who was still transfixed by the lions. "This is the best day ever," Marcus declared without hesitation, his voice full of pride. "I'm so glad we're here." Evan leaned down to kiss the top of Marcus's head. "Me too, son. Me too." And as they continued their journey through the zoo, Marcus's laughter filling the air, the Mitchell family embraced the simple beauty of being together, of experiencing life in all its wonder and joy. There would be challenges ahead, there always were, but today, they were united in a moment of pure happiness, and that was all that mattered. The unthinkable act. The family continued to explore the zoo, walking deeper into the exhibit areas, where the towering giraffes and playful monkeys kept Marcus entranced. But as they neared the lion's den, the joyful atmosphere began to shift. At first, it was subtle. Just a few raised voices in the distance and the low murmur of excited chatter. Then, without warning, a loud crash broke through the noise, followed by the unmistakable sound of a child's cry. Evan's heart skipped a beat. He turned toward the source of the noise, his instincts kicking in. Something wasn't right. Ava's eyes widened in alarm. "What's happening?" she whispered, her hand tightening around Evan's. Before they could fully process the situation, the unexpected happened. The zoo employee, a young man in a green uniform, stepped forward from behind a nearby pillar, looking around nervously. He was agitated, his face flushed with frustration. With no warning, he grabbed Marcus by the shoulders and, with a sudden, violent motion, shoved him toward the edge of the lion's enclosure. Time seemed to freeze. The crowd gasped in shock as Marcus's terrified scream echoed across the zoo. His small body tumbled awkwardly, landing with a sickening thud in the large pit below. The lions, previously lounging in the sun, began to stir, their eyes locking onto the unexpected intruder in their territory. Evan's world seemed to collapse in that moment. His legs moved on their own as he rushed forward, his heartbeat thundering in his ears. "Marcus," he yelled, his voice hoarse with fear. Ava stood frozen for a moment, her eyes wide with disbelief. This wasn't happening, this couldn't be happening. Her hands shook as she reached for her husband, but the panic that filled the air pushed her forward, too. She had to get to Marcus, too. The zoo staff near the enclosure was already moving quickly, but the scene felt surreal. The lions began to growl low, their bodies tense as they circled the pit. The roar of the crowd, the shouts of the staff, and the desperate cries from the Mitchells were drowned out by the heavy, oppressive silence between them and the lions. Marcus lay on the ground below, dazed and confused, but slowly beginning to move. His small hands pressed against the hard earth as he tried to push himself up, his face contorted in panic. One of the lions, a female with a golden mane, slowly crept closer, its eyes locked onto him with an intensity that made the hairs on Evan's neck stand on end. "Someone help him. Please." Evan shouted to no one in particular, his voice breaking as he pushed through the crowd. Every part of his being screamed to do something, anything, to save his son. Ava was close behind, her legs shaky as she stumbled toward the enclosure. "Marcus, honey, please." Her voice wavered with fear, but it was drowned out by the chaos. Her mind raced, and she knew that they didn't have much time. The lions were growing bolder, moving closer, their paws patting softly over the sand. The zoo employee who had caused this disaster stood at the edge of the enclosure, frozen in place, his hands trembling at his sides. His face was pale, and his eyes darted nervously between Marcus and the lions, clearly paralyzed by the unfolding catastrophe. He was just as terrified, but it was too late for him to do anything now. He had caused this, and there was no turning back. Evan reached the pit's edge, and his eyes locked onto Marcus, who was still trying to get his bearings. His son was so small, so fragile in this dangerous situation, and the closer the lions got, the more Evan's heart shattered. The lions' movements were slow but deliberate, as if they were testing the situation, deciding how to respond to this intrusion. One of the males, his powerful body rippling with muscle, let out a deep growl that made the crowd fall silent. "Please, no!" Evan cried out, his heart in his throat. He couldn't bear to watch, but he couldn't look away either. But then, something strange happened. The lion closest to Marcus, the one with the golden mane, stopped moving. It sat down. Its body was rigid, but it made no move to pounce. The other lions, too, remained still. They were watching Marcus, not as predators, but with something that seemed almost like curiosity. The young boy, still trembling, met their gaze. His chest heaved with each frightened breath, but he held the lion's stare, his wide eyes locked onto the powerful creature. The female lion, her eyes unblinking, tilted her head slightly as if she were trying to understand the small, frightened human in front of her. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Evan's thoughts were a blur, but he didn't care about the whys or hows. All that mattered was his son, and as the lions remained calm, he took a deep breath and extended his hand toward Marcus, trying to call out to him, "Marcus, it's okay. Just stay calm, buddy. I'm coming to get you." The lions, almost unnervingly still, continued to observe the situation. The air was heavy with tension, and Evan's heart pounded in his chest. It was as if the world was holding its breath, suspended between two possibilities, the horror of an unimaginable tragedy or the miraculous escape of a young child. Marcus, still on the ground, continued to back away slowly from the lions. He was too frightened to speak, too terrified to even think, but instinctively, he understood that the lions were not attacking. His wide eyes flicked nervously between the magnificent creatures, and something deep within him, some primal instinct, knew that he needed to remain still. He kept his hands flat against the ground, his body trembling. Ava, standing at the edge of the enclosure, couldn't take her eyes off her son. Her hands were shaking, her voice barely a whisper. "Marcus, don't move. Stay still, baby." The minutes felt like hours as the tension built, the lions watching the boy like a puzzle they couldn't solve. And then, just as the situation seemed unbearable, the zoo staff sprang into action. A team of experienced keepers, equipped with tranquilizer darts and safety gear, arrived at the scene. They moved cautiously, observing the lions and waiting for the perfect moment to intervene. But the lions, for reasons no one could quite explain, made no further move. They simply remained seated, their golden eyes still locked on Marcus, as if respecting the boy's presence. The tranquilizer guns were prepared, but it was clear now that the lions were not going to harm him, not yet, at least. It was a strange moment of silence, one that defied all expectations. Evan, still at the edge of the pit, continued to call out to Marcus, urging him to stay calm. And then, with a hesitant, almost reluctant movement, the lion closest to Marcus stood up and turned away. Its massive body rippled with muscle as it sauntered toward the back of the enclosure, followed by the others. The crowd held its breath as the lions disappeared from view, their forms vanishing into the thick brush of their habitat. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Evan took a breath, and in that brief moment, the world seemed to exhale with him. The unexpected turn. The chaos seemed to slow down, almost as if the entire zoo was holding its breath. The lions, who had previously been the very image of power and menace, now sat silently, their intense gazes fixed on Marcus. Their large, intimidating bodies, with muscles rippling under their golden coats, seemed almost out of place in this moment of stillness. The female lion, the one who had been closest to Marcus, had turned its head, almost like a guardian watching over the boy. Even the crowd, which had been in a panic just moments ago, seemed to instinctively hush, watching this bizarre, tense standoff unfold. Evan's heart raced as he stood at the edge of the pit, his gaze never leaving Marcus, who was still crouched on the ground. His son, shaking but not crying, kept his eyes wide open, never breaking his connection with the lions. His small body remained as still as possible, a silent plea for safety hanging in the air between him and the beasts. Ava, her hand tightly gripping Evan's arm, stared in disbelief. It was hard to comprehend what was happening. In all her years of living, she had never heard of a situation like this. The lions were not attacking. They were simply observing. It was as if the primal instinct to hunt had been subdued by something else, something that no one could quite understand. The zookeepers, who had been moving cautiously with tranquilizer guns aimed at the lions, now hesitated. No one knew how to respond to such an unusual situation. The lions were supposed to be fierce, territorial creatures, not passive observers. The team held their position, trying to assess the behavior of the lions, weighing the risks of action versus inaction. Every second felt like an eternity. "Stay still, Marcus. Stay calm," Evan called to his son, his voice barely a whisper, but filled with the kind of desperation only a parent could understand. Marcus's wide eyes flicked toward his father, his body stiff with fear. For a moment, it seemed like he might break down. His lips quivered, but he swallowed hard, holding back tears. He was so scared, so overwhelmed by the enormity of the situation, but something, whether it was his love for his parents or an unspoken understanding of the gravity of the moment, kept him from losing control. He wasn't sure what to do, but he trusted his father's words. And in that moment, he did what he knew best, he stayed still. Evan's mind raced. He couldn't help but think back to the countless times he'd promised his son that nothing would ever hurt him, that he would always be there to protect him. He was here now, standing on the edge of the pit, and he couldn't help Marcus, not directly. The lions were still watching, still so close. Every instinct within him screamed to leap into the pit, to save his son, but he knew that doing so would likely make the situation worse. For the first time in what felt like forever, the zoo's security team began to take control of the situation. They started to clear a wider perimeter around the enclosure, urging onlookers to step back, to give the zoo staff room to work. Slowly, methodically, they formed a line of defense between Marcus and the crowd. It wasn't much, but it created a buffer, offering some semblance of control in the chaos. Ava, her heart pounding in her chest, tried to push through the panic. She turned to one of the nearby zoo staff members, her voice shaky but urgent. "What's happening? Why aren't they moving? Why aren't the lions attacking?" The staff member, a woman in her late 20s, with dark, worried eyes, shook her head in confusion. I don't know. I've never seen anything like this. The lions are behaving strangely. It's not normal. I don't care about normal. Ava snapped, her anxiety boiling over. "Get my son out of there." The zoo worker nodded, her face pale as she glanced at the lions. "We're doing everything we can. Just, stay calm." Ava took a deep breath, trying to ground herself in the present moment. She had to stay calm, for Marcus's sake. Her heart felt as if it were being torn in two, half of her wanted to rush into the pit and grab Marcus, while the other half feared that making a move could trigger a deadly response from the lions. "Marcus, buddy, look at me," Evan called out, his voice steady despite the panic that threatened to overtake him. "We're getting you out of there. I'm going to be right there. Stay calm." Marcus nodded slightly, his eyes locked onto his father, seeking reassurance. The seconds dragged on, each one feeling like an eternity. In the pit, the lions remained unmoved, their gaze fixed on the small boy. It was then that the head zookeeper, a tall man in his 50s with graying hair and an air of quiet authority, stepped forward. His presence commanded respect, and the staff immediately parted to make room for him. He looked down into the pit with a critical eye, watching the lions' every move. His brow furrowed, but he remained silent for a long moment. Finally, he spoke. "We need to get that child out of there now," he said, his voice calm but firm. "But we need to make sure the lions don't feel threatened. We can't do this with brute force." He turned to his team, signaling them to prepare the tranquilizer guns. "Aim for the males. But we need precision. This is delicate." Evan's heart sank as he watched the team prepare to tranquilize the lions. He had hoped for a peaceful resolution, but the reality was starting to set in. His son was in immediate danger. The tranquilizers would put the lions to sleep, but there was no guarantee of how they would react in the minutes before the tranquilizers took effect. Just as the zookeepers raised their weapons, something unexpected happened. The female lion, the one closest to Marcus, slowly turned away from him, as if something within her had shifted. The other lions, too, seemed to relax. The tension in the air was palpable, but there was no aggression, just a quiet, almost resigned stillness. The head zookeeper froze, his finger hovering over the tranquilizer gun's trigger. "Hold," he whispered. "Hold your fire." Evan, his breath caught in his throat, watched as the lions began to retreat to the far end of the enclosure. It wasn't an aggressive retreat, more of a purposeful, deliberate move. Slowly, they made their way deeper into the brush of the enclosure, each step taken with an eerie calmness. The female lion, the one who had been closest to Marcus, paused and glanced back one final time before disappearing into the shadows of the tall grass. Marcus, his eyes wide with confusion, dared to move, slowly inching his way backward, away from the edge of the pit. His body trembled, but there was no danger, at least, none that he could see. "We need to get him out now." The head zookeeper's voice was urgent, and in an instant, a team of professionals moved into action. They lowered a harness down to Marcus, who hesitated for just a moment before reaching up to grab the rope. His small hands, slick with sweat, gripped it tightly. "Dad!" Marcus called out, his voice wavering with relief. "I'm coming up. I'm coming up." Evan couldn't breathe until he saw his son's face again, until he saw him being pulled safely out of the pit. Each second that passed felt like a lifetime, but finally, Marcus was hoisted over the edge, back into the arms of his father. Evan didn't even think before he wrapped his arms around his son, pulling him close. His heart raced, but it was no longer out of fear, it was out of relief, an overwhelming sense of gratitude that they had both made it out of the situation alive. "Marcus, you're safe," Evan whispered, over and over, as he held his son close. Ava, standing at the edge of the pit, let out a sob of relief as she saw her son safely back on solid ground. She rushed forward, wrapping her arms around both of them. The lions, it seemed, had retreated into the depths of the enclosure, their mysterious behavior unexplained but undeniable. The family, shaken but intact, stood together, grateful beyond words for their miracle of survival. A brave rescue. The air still felt thick with tension as Marcus was carefully pulled to safety. The family remained frozen for a moment, each of them processing what had just happened, still unable to fully grasp the enormity of the situation. Evan's arms remained around Marcus, holding him tight as though he might disappear if he let go. He could feel his son's rapid heartbeat against his chest, and his own heart echoed it, a frantic rhythm that refused to slow. Ava was standing beside them now, her hand gently resting on Marcus's shoulder. The sound of the crowd, once a loud and overwhelming cacophony of panic, seemed to fade into the background. In that moment, there was only the family, standing in the aftermath of a surreal and terrifying event. Marcus didn't speak immediately. He was still trembling in Evan's arms, his small body stiff with residual fear. Evan gently pulled back to look at his son, his voice soft but filled with love and relief. "Hey, buddy, look at me. You're safe. You're okay." Tears welled up in Marcus's eyes, and he finally allowed himself to speak. "Dad, I thought the lions were gonna." "I know," Son, Evan whispered, brushing his hand over Marcus's messy hair. I know. But you did great. You stayed calm, and that's what matters most. Ava knelt down in front of Marcus, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. You're so brave, Marcus. I don't know what I would have done if we didn't have you. Her voice was thick with emotion as she cupped his face in her hands, kissing his forehead tenderly. She could feel the weight of what they had just survived, and though the danger had passed, the fear would linger for a long time. The zoo staff, after ensuring that the lions had been safely relocated and no longer posed a threat, began to gather around the family. The head zookeeper, the one who had taken control of the situation earlier, approached them with a look of solemn relief on his face. Mr. Mitchell, Mrs. Mitchell, he said respectfully, I can't even begin to imagine how frightening this must have been for you. I just want to say that your son did something remarkable today. I've never seen a child stay so calm, especially with the lions so close. It was extraordinary. Evan, still clutching Marcus, gave the man a grateful nod but said nothing. Words couldn't fully capture the overwhelming emotions swirling inside him. He had nearly lost his son. He had almost watched the unthinkable happen. But it hadn't. Marcus was alive, and that was all that mattered now. We're just thankful, Ava said softly, her voice steady but still betraying the tremor of fear that had gripped her. Thankful that our son is safe, that everything turned out okay. The zookeeper nodded again. We're grateful too. But I'll be honest, I don't fully understand what happened with the lions. That behavior was unlike anything we've ever seen before. They didn't attack, even when they had every reason to. It was almost as if they were protecting him. Evan turned to the man, confusion knitting his brow. Protecting him? But why? Lions are. We've been studying animal behavior for decades, the zookeeper continued, his gaze intense. But this, it's hard to explain. The lions didn't show any signs of aggression. In fact, it almost looked like they were trying to communicate something. They stopped moving toward him, even when they had the chance. I've never seen anything like it. It's as if they understood that the boy wasn't a threat, that he wasn't their prey. Evan and Ava exchanged a long look. Neither of them had ever heard anything like this. The idea that lions, powerful and dangerous creatures, would behave this way, in the face of a young child's vulnerability, was both baffling and oddly comforting. Ava's voice was quiet, her eyes distant as she tried to piece together the mystery. But why? Why did they stop? The zookeeper shook his head. It's hard to say. There are so many factors at play when it comes to animal behavior. But in all my years working with wild animals, I've never seen a reaction like that. It's possible that Marcus's calmness, his stillness, played a part in how they responded to him. It could also be the energy he gave off, the way he remained composed. Perhaps it somehow communicated something to them, something that kept them at bay. Evan wasn't entirely sure he understood, but he was grateful for the zookeeper's insight. For now, the mystery of why the lions hadn't attacked would remain unanswered. But what mattered was that his son had survived, and that, in and of itself, was a miracle. We'll have a full investigation into what happened, the zookeeper added, his voice professional but still carrying a sense of awe. We've already made arrangements to move the lions to a different section of the zoo. But rest assured, Mr. and Mrs. Mitchell, that we'll be doing everything we can to ensure something like this never happens again. Evan nodded, his emotions finally beginning to settle, though a heavy weight still hung in the air. Thank you, he said, his voice hoarse with gratitude. Ava, who had remained close to Marcus, now turned her attention to the zoo staff. What about him? Is he okay? Should we take him to the hospital? She asked, her concern still evident. The head zookeeper gave a reassuring smile. Physically, Marcus looks fine. No injuries, no bruises. But I'd recommend that you take him to a doctor just to be sure. After an event like this, the emotional toll can be just as important as the physical. Evan glanced down at his son, who had begun to calm down, his wide eyes now more thoughtful than panicked. Marcus was holding onto his father's hand, his grip tight, but no longer out of fear. It was a reminder of how much they had been through, how much they had survived in the past few minutes. "We'll do that," Evan replied softly. "But right now, I think we just need to be together. To be sure we're all okay." Ava wrapped her arms around Marcus again, pulling him close to her chest. She wasn't sure if she would ever truly feel like her heart had stopped racing, but she knew that her son was safe, that they were all safe. The rest of the zoo visit was cancelled. The family was escorted back to the zoo's main entrance by security, their path now clear of crowds and onlookers. Though they walked in silence, the gravity of the situation had clearly settled into all of them. Each step away from the enclosure felt like a moment of further release from the danger they had faced. Evan glanced down at Marcus, his son's face still pale but slowly returning to its normal color. "You did so well, buddy. I'm so proud of you." Marcus nodded, his voice barely a whisper. "I was so scared, Dad, but I didn't want the lions to think I was afraid." Ava's heart broke at her son's words. In the face of the most terrifying experience of his life, Marcus had been strong. He had found the courage to stay calm, to defy his natural instinct to flee, and somehow, in doing so, he had defied all expectations. He had shown strength that not even the adults around him could have imagined. Evan squeezed Marcus's shoulder gently. "You were brave, Marcus. More than I could ever be." The car ride back to the apartment was quiet but filled with a sense of deep relief. They didn't speak much, each of them needing time to process the events of the day. But in the silence, there was a new kind of bond between them, one forged in the fires of fear and uncertainty, but strengthened by love and resilience. As they pulled into their parking spot, Evan glanced over at Marcus in the rearview mirror. "You know, buddy, no matter what happens, we've got each other. And that's all that matters." Marcus gave a small smile, the kind of smile that only children can offer after a terrifying ordeal. It was a smile of understanding, of knowing that, no matter how scary the world may seem, they were never truly alone. They were together. And that was enough.